Some scholars regard him as a traditionalist or literalist or even enemy to reason. Which one was he?
He's outside the box. He certainly commanded everybody's respect as a scholar. He knew a lot.
He outsmarts Subki.
Well, it depends which side you're on, of course. So it's been a journey of discovery which has obviously impacted me. I'd be a different person if it weren't for Ibn Taymiyya.
Would he fit in academia today?
He might have fit 20 years ago. I go back to what I said before, God is up there and we are down here.
Hello and welcome to our podcast. In this episode, my guest is probably the foremost specialist in Western academia on Ibn Taymiyya and Islamic thought in the Middle Ages, Professor Jon Hoover from University of Nottingham. We will find out how he discovered Ibn Taymiyya and his quarter of a century studying and being influenced by the man. We will talk about Ibn Taymiyya's position regarding the Mongol invaders and his courage in confronting them. We will discuss his attitude towards his opponents and also his supporters, his relationship with other notables and scholars, and his position on Greek philosophy. Then we'll delve into the core of Hoover's speciality, which is Ibn Taymiyya's philosophical contribution. And I ask, was he sectarian? And if he was alive today, would Hoover see him as a fellow professor at a university? And there are other topics too. I hope you'll enjoy the show. Welcome, Jon.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. Delighted to have you here today. And thank you for coming all the way from Nottingham.
It's my pleasure.
How was your trip?
It's very good, very relaxed.
I read some of your books and I find them really interesting and fascinating. And I'm keen to learn more about you. So let's start from the beginning. Where did you grow up and how your interest in Ibn Taymiyya came about?
So I grew up in the USA. I grew up in the agricultural area between Washington, D.C. and New York and eastern Pennsylvania.
Mm-hmm.
And I was raised in a Christian home and church, and they emphasized love of neighbor, and that still motivates me quite a bit. And then I went to university at Virginia Tech in the state of Virginia. And it's there that I had Muslim friends. I had a Muslim roommate, and one of them invited me to visit his country. And I went, and I got really curious about Islamic thought and Islamic history. Mm-hmm. And at Virginia Tech, I was studying engineering, and I finished that degree, worked in industry a little bit as well. But at the end of my time at Virginia Tech, it became clear I was shifting my interest. I took a class in Ottoman history, for example. And then I eventually did an MA in theology, theology and ethics, at a place called Anabaptist Mennonite Theological Seminary, which is in Indiana, the state of Indiana. And there I could study both Christianity and Islam. And I should explain, Anabaptist is a 16th century Protestant Reformation movement, and then the Mennonites came out of that, especially in Holland. The Netherlands came out of that eventually. So then I did some Arabic study.
Where?
First as Middlebury College, and then also in Cairo at the American University in American University of Cairo, and a place called Dar Kamboni for Arabic Studies in Zamalek in Cairo. Mm-hmm. And then I did a PhD in Islamic Studies at the University of Birmingham here in the UK. So how did I get interested in Ibn Taymiyya? Okay, so there's this story that I like to tell about when I lived in Cairo. I enjoyed walking the streets, looking at the bookshops and looking at the books on the streets. And one day I found this book called Alam al-Jinn wa Shayateen, so the world of jinn and Satans, or the world of the genies and the devils, is written by Muhammad Sulaiman al-Ashkar, who's a Palestinian scholar. And I opened the book and looked around in it, and the last chapter was on why did God create the shaitan. So in my studies of Islamic theology, they're very modest. Before that, I hadn't encountered this question. The Ash'aris, as you may know, they generally say you shouldn't be asking questions about why God does things. And I thought, okay, so here's somebody asking why God created Satan. So I looked at it a little bit more, and it was Al-Ashqar, I noted, was copying from a book by Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyya from the 14th century. And this answer was things like, well, God created Satan to give us something to struggle against, to grow in faith, and so we know the opposites between good and evil and black and white and these kinds of things, different explanations for evil. So I thought, this is really interesting. I began looking for scholarship on Ibn Qayyim, and I found a little bit, but then I discovered his teacher was Ibn Taymiyya, and so I went to do my PhD at the University of Birmingham on Ibn Taymiyya and Ibn al-Qayyim on the problem of evil and God's justice, which is what this question, why did God create Satan, gets at completely. So as I got into Ibn Taymiyya more deeply, I realized I don't have time for Ibn al-Qayyim, and I did my PhD on Ibn Taymiyya's views of God's justice and the problem of evil. So that's how I got into Ibn Taymiyya.
Can I ask who is Ibn Taymiyya, and is he relevant to us today?
So on the second question, he is relevant to us today. Maybe I'll say more about that later. But who was he? You might have to pull me out a little bit as to what exactly you're asking there. But he was a scholar who lived in Damascus, spent 7 years in Cairo. He was born in 1263, 661 in the Hijri calendar, and he died in 1328 or 728 Hijri. And he was a very intelligent, learned scholar in the Hanbali law school. And he was a man of very strong opinions and very, how can I put it, he didn't care a great deal what other people thought of him. And so he said what he thought quite often. I think it'd be good to think of him kind of as a public intellectual, a public gadfly, somebody who's saying things which are not intentionally controversial. He's a very sincere person. He believed in what he said quite thoroughly, but he believed from a different angle he believed in Islamic teachings from a different angle compared to everybody else at the time, or most everybody else at the time. So he got himself into a lot of fixes and difficulties. He's in prison several times, as you probably know. So today he is important because so many different currents of thought in the Islamic tradition since Ibn Taymiyyah up to the present time use him in different ways. So there are people today who think he was a great philosopher. There are people today who take inspiration from him for their for acts of violence. And you have everything in between. Yusuf al-Qaradawi's advocated that we should follow Ibn Taymiyyah, and thinking about how we can integrate and participate in democratic politics more fully in the West, Muslims who live in the West. So you have a whole range of uses of Ibn Taymiyyah. And I think this points back to the fact that he was a very rich thinker. He had a lot of different things. He wrote on a lot of different topics. He has a refutation of logic, he has a refutation of Christianity, he has a refutation of Shiism, Tawbur Shiism. He wrote a lot on against Fakhruddin Razi, who was an Ash'ari Kalam theologian. He had a lot to say about popular culture and shrine religion, visiting graves, and other sorts of Sufi activities. He wrote against Ibn al-Arabi. He's a rich thinker who has a lot to say about a range of topics, and so people today who may find their way into him in one direction don't realize what he's saying somewhere else. I also should say he has, thinking about law as well, and politics to some degree. So there's a whole range of ways in which that people draw upon him today.
Can you elaborate on the last point about the political thing?
Sure. I need to back up a little bit.
Yeah, of course.
And underline something about his thinking. Two things actually. So one, he's known as a person who's wants to go back to the Salaf. So the Salaf are the early Muslim community, which for Ibn Taymiyya is seen to be the source, the people who knew the Prophet Muhammad best, and they're the best interpreters of the religion of Islam, over against people who came later. So the Salaf know more about Islam than those who came later. So if we want to practice Islam and believe Islam correctly, we should go back to the Salaf. So that means Ibn Taymiyya was keen to undo lots of things that he saw had interfered in the correct teachings of Islam. So innovations, bid'ah, types of things that had emerged, practices and beliefs that weren't really there in the beginning, things that had come in from the outside. And so he was very much about removing all that stuff. That's one thing. On the other hand, so he has this kind of pure religion idea, going back to the Salaf, going back to the Quran, going back to the Prophet's practice and teachings, the Sunnah of the Prophet. So on the other hand, he's quite pragmatic. He realizes that in his society and in any society, it's very difficult to attain the ideal society, which is about worshiping God. His ultimate goal is that every human being worships God alone.
Al-ubudiyya, they call it.
Worships God alone, without any worship of any other creature, and or any creature, and that according to the prescriptions of Islam. So praying 5 times a day, fasting month of Ramadan, paying zakat and so forth, going on pilgrimage to Mecca and so forth, and according to his vision of it, of course. So he's not naive to think that everybody can do that exactly the way he would think. There's a big space between the ideal and the reality. So what do we do with the space in between? So he's all about weighing up the benefits and detriments of actions. So masalih or maslaha and mafsada or mafasid, detriments. And you may not know exactly what the legal ruling is on a certain act. So what do? There's no scholar around to tell you. Well, you have to do the best you can. So you weigh up the benefits as you understand it for the religion, and you weigh up the detriments, and you take the course of action that will be most beneficial within your limited understanding. The rulers need to do that in their decision making. Each individual needs to do that in their decision making. And so it's about what I call religious utilitarianism. You have this ideal, but you have this realistic understanding that we aren't there yet. Even from God's perspective, what's the ideal? It's everybody worshiping God alone. Well, that's obviously not happening. So even God is working toward that objective, as it were, in Ibn Taymiyya's thinking. And we should be working toward that too. So since we aren't there yet, we weigh up benefits and detriments. He talks, for example, about rulers. Ideally, rulers should be, they should be perfectly pious. They should keep order and justice. But real rulers, they might be really good fighters. They might be really good at keeping order in society, but they might not be so strong in their personal life in terms of praying 5 times a day. That's fine with him, as long as the benefits outweigh the detriments. Of course, you might want to encourage the ruler to practice better, Islam better, but if that's going to discourage the ruler from exercising or bringing about the good that the ruler is bringing about, then you leave the ruler alone. Basically, it's a very pragmatic, and I call it religious utilitarianism. You always weighing up the benefits and detriments of your actions for the overall benefit of Islam. Okay, so today you can take that type of thinking and go, different directions with it. So what's most beneficial for Islam today? Some people say, well, the situation's so bad we have to engage in violence. Others say this is completely destructive to engage in violence. We need to engage in political structures as they exist. Others say, well, we need to change a few things over here in our personal lives because the way of piety is the best way of changing the world, not changing political structures. So you can draw on Ibn Taymiyya for all these arguments if you want to. So that's that's where how
Okay.
I see him.
I think he was a refugee. He fled Harran
Yeah.
during the Mongol invasion. Did that episode affect his views and life?
So yes, when he was, I think, 6 years old, the area in which he was living in Harran, southeastern Turkey today, was overrun by the Mongols, and he fled with his family. His family fled, and they took him with him. So I think that certainly was a traumatic event. Whether that shaped his whole life and his whole future, it's very difficult to say. I don't think we have enough information to do a psychological analysis on Ibn Taymiyya's childhood and his traumas and so forth, how that worked out. But what we do know is that he saw the Mongols as a profound threat to the proper teachings and practice of Islam. And as they invaded a couple of times into Syria, he visited their camp a time or two. He learned about what they believed. And for example, he understood them to say that all religions are equal, like Judaism, Christianity, Islam, they're all of equal value. There's no, Islam is not superior to Judaism, Christianity. And you have the Mongol law, the Mongol yasa. So he learned all these things. And he felt that Mongol way of being Muslim was really a profound threat to Islam as he knew it in the Mamluk Empire in Syria and Egypt. And so he was for resisting that as long as the Mongols were invading.
Physically?
It's a little unclear, but it seems he did participate in one battle. I forget which one. But he was advocating for jihad. He preached in the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus. But so there's an invasion from 1299. There's an invasion 1299 and 1300, the winter 1299, 1300. There's another invasion 1300, 1301, so winter of 1301. And then another one in 1303. So there's 3 invasions of the Mongols into northern Syria, into Syria. So the first one, the Mongols took Damascus. And it's interesting here because after they took control of Damascus, he then advocated for all resistance from the Mamluk side to stop, because it's clear the Mongols were in charge. So again, this is his pragmatic, more benefits and detriments. He didn't see any benefit in continuing to fight because they were in control, and anybody who would continue to resist would just get crushed. So that's not beneficial. So he was actually negotiating help to there's particularly somebody in the citadel in Damascus who was still holding out against the Mongols while they were ruling the rest of the city. And he tried to get that person to stop, resisting. So it needs to be said that Ibn Taymiyya was very much for a stable society. So there's this saying which he does adopt in a couple of different places, that 60 years with an unjust sultan is better than one night of anarchy. So I look at that whole situation there in Damascus at that time. If we're going to have anarchy, the Mongols are in control, they rule, we live with them. Now they eventually left, and they came back the following year and didn't really succeed the following year at all. They failed, they went back northeast. But you see, I'm talking about his approach to dealing with politics.
Yeah.
He's very much, you work with what you've got and try within that framework to advance increasing religiosity, to help people grow more increasingly religious, pray more faithfully, keep the rights of the religion, and be more truthful, more just. So if you're cheating your customers in the market, you don't do that anymore. But he's about a more just and more religious society, however you can get there.
Post 9/11, the growing interest in Ibn Taymiyya was mainly for security reasons. Did that harm our understanding of Ibn Taymiyya?
It did in a certain fashion, insofar as the security community's interests frequently drew a line from Ibn Taymiyya to Ibn Abdul Wahhab, of course the reformer in Arabia in the 18th century, then to Sayyid Qutb, and then to like Islamic Jihad, the assassins of Anwar Sadat, the president of Egypt in 1981, on to Al-Qaeda, and I guess you can extend that then beyond to ISIS and so forth after 9/11. But parallel to that, there's been especially 9/11, post 9/11, there's been an interest among certain academics in looking a bit deeper into who Ibn Taymiyyah was. And an important milestone in the study of Ibn Taymiyyah was a conference in 2005 at Princeton University. I was privileged to be there and give a paper. This was organized by Professor Michael Cook, who is now retired from Princeton. And he got some funding, I think it's from the Carnegie Foundation, to put out a call for scholars to come and give papers on Ibn Taymiyyah. And he had some graduate students also working at Princeton who were interested in this as well. So a number of us met and we talked about all sorts of aspects of Ibn Taymiyyah. And that was published eventually in 2010, the proceedings from that, in a book, Ibn Taymiyyah in His Times, which was a collection of essays by scholars who gave papers. And that was edited by Shihab Ahmed and Yusuf Rappaport. Shihab Ahmed, of course, passed away. He was a professor at Harvard, and Yusuf Rappaport is a professor at Queen Mary University here in London.
What was your paper about?
My paper was about Ibn Taymiyyah's views on what he calls the voluntary attributes. And it talks about the temporalization of God. But the book in general is very wide-ranging. And there's an article in there on Ibn Taymiyyah's Jama'a, his group of followers. And that's interesting because it shows that he only had, say 10 followers in a group. He wasn't a leader of a large mosque or had a huge following of students. But he was, his devotees, the people who really cared about him and stuck together with him, it was a very small number. There's an article in there on his views of the caliphate, as I recall. There's articles on theology, including mine. An article on his views of law by Yusuf Rappaport, and a number of other studies, one on his views of Shiism, and so forth. So this book, it drew some of us together, and as other, like myself, I was very inspired. Oh, well, there's room here for more work, obviously. I knew that anyway in my area, but other people were working on other aspects of Ibn Taymiyyah. So that's an important milestone. There have been other monographs. I can mention a few. There's been a monograph by Sofia Vasilou, 2016, on Ibn Taymiyyah's theological ethics. There is a book by Farid Suleiman, very recently in German, 2019, on God and Ibn Taymiyyah and God's attributes. There's a book by Professor Al-Matrudi here in London on Ibn Taymiyyah and the Hanbali Law School. There's a book in 2020 by Karl Sharif al-Tobhi on Ibn Taymiyyah's epistemology, particularly in his big book, Dar al-Ta'arud. So these studies are investigating things that really the security studies crowd isn't that interested in. And so we're getting a much more diverse range, I think a much more diverse view of Ibn Taymiyyah, the different aspects of him, and the ways in which he goes beyond just being an inspiration to jihadi terrorism. In fact, the texts which jihadis who engage in violent acts draw upon, it's a very small sliver of his big corpus of writings. So this is helping us gain a much wider view of what Ibn Taymiyyah is about. When we talk about study of Ibn Taymiyyah in the Western Academy, I need also to mention a very important figure, Yahya Misho, who is recently retired from Hartford Seminary in the state of Connecticut in the US. he has lots of very meticulous studies on, he tends to have translates a section of Ibn Taymiyya's text and then gives a really in-depth introduction to the text and contextualizes it. So Yahya Micho's...
Where is he from?
Yahya Micho's Belgian, and he's a Francophone. So a lot of the earlier works, and even some more recently, are in French. And these works, although they're maybe not as well known, have been foundational for the rest of us working in the field in terms of the setting a very high standard, very high academic standard, high quality, and also excavating ideas on Ibn Taymiyya's spirituality. For example, Micho published a volume, I think it's 2012, of translations, which he titles, I think, Ibn Taymiyyah Against Extremism or Against Extremisms or something like that. So there's translations of Ibn Taymiyyah's text in there on love. There's a text on Joseph and his experience in Egypt. A whole range of translations which Micho uses to try to show that Ibn Taymiyyah is not just, or not even, in Micho's view, not even rightly an inspiration for the for violent action in the name of Islam. So these are some really important changes in the field that, okay, yes, security studies have given Ibn Taymiyyah a very, we get a very limited view of him from security studies. But these academic studies have been broadening broadening our understanding of him much more widely, such that it's now having an impact actually back on security studies. So there's this recent book on Wahhabism that was published, where the author is drawing upon research on Ibn Taymiyyah that others in the field are doing, and he's gained a much deeper understanding of Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn Abdul Wahhab's drawing upon Ibn Taymiyyah than we could have done, let's say, 20 years ago. So there's interaction back and forth, and the word is certainly getting out there that Ibn Taymiyyah is of interest for a whole wide range of people that previously may have written him off as either crazy or totally a violent extremist or something like that.
So you're talking about the aspects of Ibn Taymiyyah actually will lead me to my next question. Some scholars regard him as a traditionalist or literalist or even enemy to reason, while others will regard him as a reformer or even a philosopher. Which one was he?
So I call him a philosophical theologian. And he's a bit of all those things you just mentioned. How can we pull all this together? Yeah. So traditionalist, I'd say yes, he's a traditionalist because he's working within that strand of Islam that is called the Hanabila, the Hanbalis. They're called traditionalists. They work with the Ahl Hadith, who are working with the Hadith text as the foundational documents of the Islamic religion, the Sunnah of the Prophet, the Quran, very carefully trying to sift through all that traditional material, all those traditions, in order to understand what Islam is supposed to be. So he's very much in that strand. What he's doing, though, with it is he's rationalizing it. He's trying to tell his readers what the rationale for it is, what's the underlying philosophical framework, you might say. So let's then step aside. Why does he get this anti-reason? And why do people think he's just completely irrationalist or anti-rationalist? So he wrote a refutation of Greek logic. And that refutation of Greek logic is, by and large, against Ibn Sina's logic, Al-Ghazali's logic, and Al-Ghazali, of course, was instrumental in mainstreaming logic into kalam and into law. So Ibn Taymiyyah, his theological positions do not align with Al-Ghazali's, they do not align with Asharism, with Maturidism, with Mu'tazilism. his theological positions are different, and a lot of his theological position is rooted in a kind of empiricism and what's called nominalism with respect to universals. I'm not going to go down to these philosophical terms, but some people call it conceptualism. But these types of principles we're talking about here are characteristic of modern thought in the West, as well as everywhere else too. But he's taking a different perspective on the Greek tradition than the people like Al-Ghazali and Ibn Sina. So he's trying to remove himself from the Greek tradition. He doesn't escape completely, but and modern people like John Stuart Mill and Immanuel Kant and the whole modern philosophical movement in the West is also, ditching, is basically leaving behind Aristotle and Plato. So, not entirely again, of course, but in many respects. So Ibn Taymiyya is, in some sense, similar to modernity, Western modernity. In that sense, he's going back to the Salaf. He's rejecting lots of tradition. He is relativizing the madhabs, the legal madhabs. He's disagreeing profoundly with Ash'arism, with Mu'tazilism, and he's disagreeing with Ibn Sina. And he has this view of God and view of religion, which fits quite nicely in the modern period, in certain fashion, because it is rejecting the Greek tradition. So if you think that rationality is Greek logic, then he's anti-rational.
Mm.
But if you see rationality as much broader, as something which is a kind of way of thinking about the world, and that way of thinking about the world can be Hellenistic in its intuitions. It can be Aristotelian, it can be Platonic, or it can be different from that, and it can be something which I've been calling modern. And so he's in that stream. He's empiricist, and as I said before, with respect to the problem of universals, he's a conceptualist. So things don't have essences. This glass, for example, I just call it a glass. But in fact, it's just a convention that you and I are using to name that a glass, but there's no essence. There's nothing really in there that's the shape of a glass. Whereas Plato is a form of glass up in the sky somewhere, being very crude about it. And for Aristotle, there's an essence which is contained within the glass. But for Ibn Taymiyya, there is no essence in that glass. It's only an essence which I assign to it. And that's also a very modern idea in terms of Western modernity. So if we then accept that Ibn Taymiyya has got this different rationality, we can start talking about, well, what are his philosophical ideas? Mm. What are the, I wouldn't say innovations he's bringing, but what are the things that are energizing his thinking?
We'll come to his philosophical contributions, but back to my question, was he a literalist?
So back to literalism. Depends what you mean. So no, in a technical sense. Mm. So I'm going to do a little theology here. He is literalist in the sense that you would understand it when you think of where is God. So God is above. And that means that God is not here. That means God is way up there. Okay, you try to say that's a literal understanding of what it means for God to be above, because the Quran affirms that God is above, or God is above the throne, or God has risen over the throne, God is sitting over the throne, something to this effect. So that means God is above, and Ibn Taymiyya affirms that full-heartedly, in the plain sense of the word, that God is above. God is not here, God is way up there. So for an Ash'ari theologian, this is really strange, okay? Because to say that God is located somewhere is, is it heresy? Maybe. It's certainly wrong, okay? And for Ibn Taymiyya, and Ash'ari would say Ibn Taymiyya is being literalist about this. Ibn Taymiyya says, no, I'm not being literalist. And you might say, what is going on here? He's not being literalist. No, he's saying I'm being contextualist. I'm thinking about aboveness in a way which is appropriate to the context of our conversation. We are here on earth. the context of our conversation, and God is above. That's our context. But if we talk about an issue which is a little more complicated now, and that is, it says in the Quran, God is with us wherever we are. Now, if Ibn Taymiyya were a literalist, God would be here, God would be there, right? God is with us wherever we are. He says, no, not at all. Because given the context of the conversation, since we already know that God is above, God cannot be literally, or God cannot be actually
with his
ontologically. Sorry?
With his knowledge is with us.
Well, oh, you're getting ahead of me, yeah. So instead we say God is with us in his knowledge. Now the Ash'ari would say, you got it right, to Ibn Taymiyya. But the Ash'ari would say, now you're doing a non-metaphoric, or you're doing a non-literal interpretation. Ibn Taymiyya says, no, I'm interpreting this. I'm not doing literal or non-literal. I'm not doing literal or metaphorical interpretation. I'm understanding God being with us in the way appropriate to its context. So your literalism, your non-literalism and all that is just the wrong way of thinking about it. The right way of thinking about this is the context in which we're speaking these words. The fundamental context is God is above and not here ontologically, not here in a sense of being right with us. God is here in his knowledge, in his care, in his providential care as well. So a long way to answer is Ibn Taymiyya a literalist? So he rejects it, but he gets to much the same place when it comes to God's nearness. But when it comes to God's aboveness, he's in a totally different place from the Ash'aris and the Maturidis.
For you, is this a contradiction to Ibn Taymiyya?
Well, it's obviously different from the Ash'aris, but is Ibn Taymiyya himself being contradictory? I don't think so. So let's go back to what I was saying earlier about his way of approaching, or about being, modern. So his understanding of language is contextual or pragmatic, and this is much closer to what we have in the modern period with Wittgenstein. So Ludwig Wittgenstein was a famous British philosopher. And here, for him, for Wittgenstein and for Ibn Taymiyya, what determines the meanings of words is their context and their use. Words are not given meanings that are somehow aligned with them. So I'll give you the famous example of the lion. This is all through the literature. You may have encountered it. So, for a literalist, in the technical sense of the word, there is the cat, the huge cat that on the African savannah, and that is a literal lion. Okay? And if we talk about a soldier who is valiant and brave on the battlefield, and we call him a lion, that is a non-literal or metaphorical, allegorical interpretation or use of that term, lion. Ibn Taymiyya says there is no lion on the savannah that is that has the word lion, L-I-O-N, attached to it literally. Rather, we use the word contextually. If we see a big cat in the savannah, we say lion. If we see the soldier in the battlefield who is valiant, we say lion. But there's no preference one over the other. The word lion, if we see the valiant soldier, we can say lion without having to think about the cat. That person is a lion, and that's our normal usage. And we don't have to think, cat, big cat in Africa. Now we're going to change the meaning to a non-literal meaning. No, we just go immediately, straightforward with the word in context. Likewise, we hear the term God is above. We heard God is above, and then that means God is not here within Ibn Taymiyya's frame of reference. It's not the Ash'ari frame of reference. For the Ash'aris, I should say, God is outside time and space. So, it's a different category. Whereas Ibn Taymiyya, God is spatially above. So, then when we hear that God is with us wherever we are, we have to think about the meaning of that within the wider context. Since God is way above, God cannot be with us in the sense that you might immediately think, as you're here next to me, that is, God's different. God's our understanding of God being near with us is going to be different automatically without having to think through all this, to go through all these mental gymnastics that the Ash'aris go through.
Okay, so you consider him as a theologian.
Philosophical theologian.
Philosophical theologian. Yeah. So what's his philosophical contributions?
So his conceptualism or nominalism, which I've already mentioned, on universals, so that there are no essences in things or outside of things. The essences are in our minds only, concepts. Sometimes it's called nominalism. That's one. And that connects really well with modernity, as I've indicated. And that's one reason that some contemporary Arab thinkers are really enthusiastic about Ibn Taymiyya as a philosopher. I don't go there. I don't say he's a philosopher myself, but that's some people taking him in that direction. The thing I think is most interesting and most important is his temporalization of the divine essence. What do I mean by that?
Yeah.
Yeah?
What do you mean by that?
Yeah. So if we take Kalam theologians like the Ash'aris, God is outside time. God is eternal in a timeless sense. We take Ibn Sina, Ibn Rushd, the philosophers, in the Hellenistic tradition, God is outside time, God is timeless. And so there's this question then, how do we get from God, and how does God have a will that is active, and how does God create the world when God is timeless? You know, how do we cross that gap? Ibn Taymiyya solves all that by essentially putting time inside of God. So he doesn't call this explicitly, I'm putting time inside of God. He says God has voluntary attributes. God does things by God's power and God's will. And these are activities. So we have voluntary attributes and voluntary acts. But he does allow that this is equivalent to what the Ash'aris would call putting hawadith in the essence of God. Hawadith, that is temporally originating events, basically time, temporal events inside of God's essence, which the Ash'aris reject completely as entailing a God who is somehow defective, imperfect. Ibn Taymiyya turns all this on its head and he says a God who is outside of time, a God who is not active and involved in temporal history is imperfect. He's just frozen. Ibn Taymiyya doesn't say he's frozen, but basically that's what he's implying. Whereas a God who is perfect is going to be active and busy, if you will. So Ibn Taymiyya's view of God is that God has been acting from eternity, one thing after another, creating things, doing things, speaking. God has been speaking by his power and his will. So God is always active, and this is out of God's perfection. So I think this is a major philosophical, he's making some major philosophical moves here to get to his theological outcome, where God is intimately involved in the historical process, or I think it's more accurate to say God's history is creating the history, our history, because God creates everything, of course, for Ibn Taymiyya. And we don't need to puzzle over this distinction between time, you know, the lack of time in God and our temporality. There's a time in God, there is temporality in God, and so God works in time. For example, Ibn Taymiyya talks about when God gives a command to do something. Then the person does it. Then God learns that the person's done it, not before. So God knows from eternity that person's going to do it, but he doesn't learn that God has actually, he doesn't learn the person's done it until it happens. So there's a sense of which God is not learning. God's knowledge is perfect, but that perfection entails a certain process of being in touch with the historical process, not being removed from it and distanced from it and out of touch. So that's another, I think that's the biggest contribution from my perspective. Other philosophical contributions, there's empiricism. You know, he is of the view that if something is real, it's going to be accessible to the five senses. That doesn't mean that everything that exists we can see right now. God, for example. Maybe some prophets have seen God, or somebody has seen God in dreams, but most human beings have to wait until the hereafter to see God. But God is a seeable being with our eyes in front of us, just like you're in front of me in the hereafter. So it's a sense in which, empiricism, in the sense that everything that exists is accessible to the senses, even if we don't, individually see everything. We're not.
How does it differ from empiricism in Western philosophy?
A big difference is that he includes God. So many people would say empiricism as leading away from belief in God, leading away from a kind of unseen realm. So the unseen realm for Ibn Taymiyya is unseen. That doesn't mean it's not seeable, given the right conditions. In other words, we wait till the hereafter, or a prophet might have a special vision, or something like that, like the prophet's vision of when he went on the night journey, seeing different stages up to heaven and then down to hell and so forth. So that's the unseen to most people. But for a more Platonic tradition, the unseen is something that's outside the empirical realm. And in Western empiricism, once you strip away that unseen, non-empirical realm, you don't have God anymore. Whereas for Ibn Taymiyya, you have God, because God is seeable. In fact, Ibn Taymiyya says because God is the most perfect, God is perfect, God is more seeable than we are, because we're not perfect. We're far less than perfect. So when we get to the hereafter, God will be more seeable than you and me, which is a bit puzzling, but that's where he's going. And that's what I mean by his empiricism, in the sense that everything is potentially visible or potentially hearable, if God is speaking. And so that's another contribution. And he's drawing on Ibn Rushd, Averroes in Western terms. So Ibn Rushd is not saying this by any stretch of the imagination. But he does say, Ibn Rushd says that for the awam, for the ordinary people, they basically need to believe something like this. But of course, being a philosopher, he knows better. Ibn Taymiyya strongly dislikes that kind of distinction between the ordinary people and the elite. Ibn Taymiyya says the instincts, the intuitions, the knowledge of the ordinary people actually is the right knowledge. What the philosophers are going off about is actually completely wrong. But for Ibn Rushd, though, provides the rationale for the ordinary people's belief in some of his writings, and Ibn Taymiyya is drawing on that to help him articulate his own views. So those are three different things I think are important philosophical contributions.
We mentioned many aspects of Ibn Taymiyya. Was he a sectarian?
Was Ibn Taymiyya a sectarian? It really depends what you mean by sectarian. So if you're talking about somebody who's very narrow-minded and a leader of a certain very narrow-minded and even violent sort of contingent of people within a society, and we might think of the conflicts in Northern Ireland here between the Protestants and the Catholics. So sometimes that has devolved into sectarian violence, and we have a sectarian situation where people identify politically according to, along lines of religion. So within the Sunni fold, Ibn Taymiyya is perhaps not sectarian in that fashion, but when we move to Shiism, when we move to Christianity, yes, he's sectarian. But I would argue that the Sunni tradition in general draws those lines, and Ibn Taymiyya is not that unusual. What Ibn Taymiyya perhaps is a little bit more unusual is he's very adamant about drawing these lines firmly, like with Shiism. He wrote a huge book on Shiism. He wrote the largest refutation of Christianity in the Islamic tradition. So he's very careful. He wants to draw those lines perhaps more sharply than other Sunni colleagues of his. But if you look at societies in the Middle East even to today, people organize their, the laws according to marriage, laws of marriage, and so they are religiously defined. you have there's laws for Muslims about how they marry. There are laws for Christians and there are laws for Jews. So most, I think, Arab countries at least, they're organized like this. So that's a sectarianism, which can be very moderate and very, people can get along really well in that type of environment. So it really depends what you mean by sectarianism. And I would say Ibn Taymiyya, if you want to make a spectrum, he is more sectarian than most. And he is quite, so in the Mamluk period, in his day, there was a lot of crossover, Christians, or rather Muslims involving themselves in Christian festivals, and Jews and Christians and Muslims going to the same tomb, same saints' tombs, and it's fluid. And this helps society work a bit, and also in business, you don't want to get too rigid about your categories of people, because then it's bad for business. Even politically as well, it's about keeping society running smoothly. That's what most people want. Mm-hmm. Ibn Taymiyya really did want people to observe the religious lines. So he was, if there was a Muslim painting an Easter egg, for example, that was bad. And he was worried that Muslims, if they get too deeply involved in Christian activities, they might end up getting baptized by mistake. So he didn't want that. So he's about drawing those lines. So in that sense, he was sectarian in a firmer way than maybe the rest of his society for sure.
Is he a historian of ideas?
I might call him a historian of prophecy.
Mm-hmm.
So which involves ideas, of course. And he is not happy just to say that some belief is wrong or some practice is wrong. He wants to tell you where it came from. So if we talk about the whole, the way the Ash'aris think and Mu'tazilis think, he traces that back to two figures named Ja'd ibn Dirham and Jahm ibn Safwan. And then he says, I forget which one, gets it from outside the tradition, and I think it's Jahm gets it from his interlocutors from among the Buddhists and so forth. So the people in the Central Asia. So there's that. But sometimes he does a little bit more even, which I find fascinating. So he has this, he has the refutation of Christianity, Jawab Sahih, liman baddala din al-Masih, the correct answer to those who change the religion of Christ. And you might think, okay, he's just going to tell you why Christianity is wrong, and Judaism as well, why it's wrong and why Islam is right. He does more than that. He's explaining why we needed Judaism and why we needed Christianity, or to be more specific, why we needed Moses and the Torah, and why we needed Christ and the gospel before we get to Muhammad. So, what is God doing that we didn't just get the complete full truth at the beginning? That would seem to have made sense, mm-hmm. right? So he has an explanation for what's going on historically. I find this really fascinating. So what he says is that the children of Israel, they were slaves in Egypt under the Pharaoh, and they needed they needed a revelation, they needed a law which was severe to toughen them up so that they could resist the Pharaoh and they could be freed and find their way out of captivity. But then within that framework of the Torah, they became too hard. They became like Pharaoh was, basically. So God in his wisdom sent Jesus and Christ mm-hmm. with a more lenient approach, a more gracious approach. And that balanced out, as it were, the harsh approach. But then, this is really indicative of Ibn Taymiyya's way of thinking. Christianity got it wrong in two ways, coming out of Christ and the Injil. You have Christian rulers who really find that they're harsh, they're tyrants, and they're not that interested in religion, but they're Christian somehow. So they build they develop a kind of politics which is tyrannical. And you have Christian monks who think they're really, really, Christian and really pious, but they leave aside the importance of politics. So we have this polarity in Christian societies, according to Taymiyyah now, between the scrupulous, pious monks, the people of religion, and we have the Christian rulers who are tyrants, and we need to balance this out. So we have the revelation of the Quran to the Prophet Muhammad to bring these things into balance. So Ibn Taymiyyah spins this story. He doesn't just say, there's a figure from the century earlier, Qaddafi, is an Egyptian jurist. He also has a refutation of Christianity. And he just says that, Christianity's got this wrong and Islam got this right. Whereas Ibn Taymiyyah is saying, no, there's a reason for all this stuff in the past. So he's giving a kind of a prophetic history, if you will, a history of prophecy, which is making sense of how we get to the Prophet Muhammad and the Quran. He goes even further.
How come?
And he says that Moses is the prophet of Jalal, and Jesus is the prophet of Jamal, and that Muhammad is the prophet of Kamal, perfection. So I should translate this in English. So Moses is the prophet of Jalal, so that's like
Mighty.
Mightiness, awesomeness, and then Jamal is beauty. So Jesus is the prophet of Christ is the prophet of beauty, and Muhammad is the prophet of perfection, which brings these two together. So when I first discovered this, I was like, where's this coming from? This sounds like Ibn Arabi. It's a very Sufi approach to theology, because in Sufi theology, in the theology of Ibn Arabi, you have the attributes of Jalal, the attributes of mightiness and awesomeness, and you have the attributes of Jamal, the attributes of beauty. And then, of course, part of the Sufi path is to balance these things out and become, achieve perfection. So I couldn't find this in Ibn Arabi himself, but I found this in Afif ad-Din at-Tilimsani, who was a Sufi from the late 1200s. And somebody, Ibn Taymiyyah, polemicized against a lot. But anyway, Tilimsani has this very similar idea. And so I'm not saying Ibn Taymiyyah necessarily got it from there, but Ibn Taymiyyah is drawing here on a Sufi kind of paradigm, helping him develop his historical narratives and looking at how the history of prophecy achieves its final full and perfect balance in the Prophet Muhammad. So I find that really fascinating.
I would like you to elaborate a bit more about the Ibn Arabi, Ibn Taymiyyah relation.
First thing needs to be said about this is that Ibn Taymiyyah is clear in one of his texts that he enjoyed reading Ibn Arabi, respect for Ibn Arabi, for basically the first 40 years of his life.
In Fatawa?
No, the Futuhat al-Makkiyah, so it's the Meccan openings.
He mentioned it in Fatawa.
Yes. Well, Ibn Taymiyyah's, the Fatawa, the Majmu'ah Fatawa is, of course, a modern collection. Includes lots of Ibn Taymiyyah's treatises. So in one of the treatises which he wrote, like 1304 maybe, he turns against Ibn Arabi and says, I really used to appreciate reading Ibn Arabi, the Futuhat al-Makkiyah. Then I read the Fusus al-Hikam. So the Fusus al-Hikam, we can translate the bezels of
wisdom,
knowledge, or the bezels of wisdom. There's some really amazing ideas in there, you might say. So, for example, Ibn al-Arabi can be understood to say that when the children of Israel bowed down to the golden calf, they're worshiping God, because, in fact, everything that anybody does is worship of God. We can't help but worship God because there is only God. So Ibn Taymiyyah is like, this is really going off the deep end here. This is basically God is everything, and that's pure heresy, because I go back to what I said before. God is up there and we are down here, and there's no mixing ontologically in terms of God's being. So once Ibn Taymiyyah had that in mind, then he really turned against Ibn Arabi as a source of great error among his...
Because of Wahdat al-Wujud.
Yeah, Ibn Arabi doesn't say Wahdat al-Wujud, but other people following him use this word Wahdat al-Wujud, so the unity of existence, that there is only God. that there's nothing in existence but God. So what do we do with us? Is this yeah, well, that's God at the end of the day. From one angle, I mean, Ibn Arabi and his followers were very careful and very smart. They always see things from two sides. But Ibn Taymiyya emphasized polemically the side of these fellows that said that it's just God. And so he says, no, this is dead wrong. Because as we know, God is up there and we're down here. There's that complete separation. So that turned Ibn Taymiyya against Ibn Arabi and his followers in his own day. And he wrote some treatises and letters against Ibn Arabi, which got him in some trouble.
How did Ibn Taymiyya differ from his other scholars of his time?
Right. So an obvious one, he wasn't married. So most scholars, and even he said that a man should marry. It's a religious obligation. But he didn't marry. So we can talk about why that might have been. And I mentioned before.
Do you have an answer for that?
There's a scholar named Yahya Misho, I mentioned him earlier, who has written a whole article on this question. What might be the reason? So,
and he concluded.
Go ahead.
He concluded what?
Well, a possibility is that Ibn Taymiyya was so dedicated to his scholarship that using this balancing the detriments and benefits way of thinking, he couldn't achieve the perfect obedience to the law. So weighing up the benefits and detriments, maybe it's because he was doing that kind of calculation. But we don't really know. So other ways in which he was different, he was certainly, I think he was probably the brightest alim, the brightest scholar in Cairo and Damascus. He certainly commanded everybody's respect as a scholar. He knew a lot. He was very agile of mind.
He outsmarts Subki?
He outsmarted a Subki. Well, it depends which side you're on, of course. But what I can say is that Subki's writings in response to Ibn Taymiyya are far less sophisticated than Ibn Taymiyya's writings. So I think that illustrates what I just said, that he probably was the smartest scholar of his time. So he differs in that way. The other way in which he differs is he really is pushing out positions which are going against the mainstream scholarly positions. So we can go on issues of God's attributes. Even within his own traditionalist circles, he made people really nervous because many of those traditionalist thinkers were like, when it comes to God's attributes, we affirm them, but we don't try to understand their meanings. Their meanings are known only to God. Whereas Ibn Taymiyya was of the view that, well, if you don't think about the meanings, people are going to get wrong ideas about God's attributes. So we have to actually help people with the meanings. And the meanings he came up with weren't that of the Ash'ari mainstream or the Ash'ari dominant culture of the day. So, and he differed on things like triple divorce. He said that he ruled eventually that when a man says to his wife, I divorce you 3 times, it only counts as 1. That was against the consensus of the scholars of the day. So he did not hesitate to differ on rulings and theological views. So that's how he differed. But apart from that, he was a simple man and a fairly ordinary scholar, like other scholars of his time.
Talking about other scholars, I had this impression after reading Al-Razi that Ibn Taymiyya actually indebted to Al-Razi. But Salafis nowadays, they don't recognize this debt.
Ibn Taymiyya is indebted to Al-Razi for sure, in that if it weren't for Fakhruddin Al-Razi, Ibn Taymiyya wouldn't have the vocabulary he uses. Al-Razi sets the theological agenda of the day. So when it comes to issues of God's attributes, it's Al-Razi that Ibn Taymiyya is working with. And when it comes to issues like of the human act, Ibn Taymiyya can be very polemical and say, Al-Razi and Ash'arism, they're off and so forth. But if you look at the actual structure of Ibn Taymiyya's theology on the human act, so God creates, our acts. And there's not like the Mu'tazilis who think that we create our own acts, so we're responsible for them in the sense that we have freedom to do differently than we do. Ibn Taymiyya says we're responsible for our acts, but it's not because that we have some kind of independent will. It's because God creates these acts in us. They're not God's acts, they're our acts, so we're responsible for them even though God creates them. And if you look at Al-Razi's formulations of the human act, they're very similar. Al-Razi has a bit different tone. When it comes to the theology of it or the philosophical undergirding of it, it's basically the same. So that's a sense, where Ibn Taymiyya, you could say he's indebted. There's another issue where it's much more interesting. So Al-Razi was a thinker who was very, very, searching. And he would say, well, there's this argument on this side, and there's this argument on that side, and I'm confused or not confused. I'm really not sure which side it is, or it could go both ways. And Al-Razi sometimes goes down alleys or down directions that really don't fit with the rest of his theology. So there's an example about Al-Razi says that at some point in one of his very late works, Matalib al-Aliyah, that the only rational position on hawadith or originating events is that they're in God's essence, which is completely against traditional Ash'arism. And this is what Ibn Taymiyya says as well, that we have originating events, we have temporality within God. So Ibn Taymiyya works through in his theology consistently what Fakhruddin Razi just drops on a page or two as kind of like, where'd that come from? And Razi, you're not sure that he's really convinced by it either. So that's a way in which Ibn Taymiyya is drawing and indebted to Fakhruddin Razi. So I'm sure there are others which, if we looked into it in more depth, there's another one that's worth mentioning is the whole idea that the value of human acts is dependent on their consequences, so a kind of consequentialism. We have this in Al-Ghazali as well, and Fakhruddin Razi. Ibn Taymiyya is also the view that acts, but acts, they're not intrinsically wrong or right in their very essence. That was the Mu'tazili view. And it's not just because God said this is right and this is wrong without any reasoning on our part. No, it's a matter of things are right or wrong depending on the consequences, depending on the benefits and detriments. So we find this in Al-Razi too. So Ibn Taymiyya spins it differently, but there's resources in Al-Razi you can draw from.
Another methodology other than the kalam, using hadith methodology, muhaddithin methodology to reach the same conclusion?
I wouldn't put it that starkly. So Ibn Taymiyya is of course looking for hadith, he's looking for Quranic texts that say what he interprets the Quran like this. But no, he's also doing, we can call it kalam, he's doing, I'd call it philosophical theology, because it's not quite kalam, he doesn't organize books in a kalam fashion, but he's using kalam argumentation, he's using philosophic argumentation. In fact, there are long stretches sometimes in his writings, especially in his refutation of logic, where there's no Quran, no hadith, so he can do rational argumentation, and he does. Whether we call it kalam, I hesitate because it's not organized in the kalam fashion. But yes, he's using rational argumentation that he's borrowing from his predecessors.
Let's say if Ibn Taymiyya was alive today, or is alive today, and you've been teaching in universities for how long?
14 years.
14 years. Would he fit in academia today? Do you see him as a university professor?
He might have fit 20 years ago.
Why?
Because academia 20 years ago, in Britain at least, had more room than it does now for eccentric kinds of people. So, in the UK, as in other parts of the West, especially in the US, Canada, universities have become much more finance-driven, much more focused on making sure that the money's the primary thing, as opposed to learning for learning's sake, we might say. And in British universities, there have been many people of very differing kinds. And Ibn Taymiyya may have fit. I don't know if he'd wanted it. I don't know if he'd appreciated the role, but so it depends on the time and place. The university system that he would be, putting himself into. Maybe there's a place today somewhere in the West where he would fit, I don't know. But he was a bit eccentric. He was strong-minded, so if you would be his head of department, it might be quite difficult.
Okay, you accompanied Ibn Taymiyya for how long? 30 years now?
No, 20 years.
20 years.
Or maybe a bit longer, actually.
Did he leave any influence on the personal level of your life?
Yeah.
How so?
It's a good question. Concretely, I've spent a lot of time with him, so how could I not help but be influenced by him and thinking about his problems? I remember an instance when I was doing my PhD when I was really trying to understand something, and this is a point I need to make generally speaking. There are points in Ibn Taymiyya's theology that are not intuitive to a person who might know something more generally about medieval thought, whether it's Islamic thought, Jewish thought, or Christian thought. He's outside the box on many things he thinks. So I was thinking about something in my PhD. I was up at night, I couldn't sleep, and suddenly it clicked. This temporalization of divine essence, that's what he's doing. So yeah, that's a big influence. I mean, it's like, oh wow, this is amazing. So it's been a journey of discovery, which has obviously impacted me. I'd be a different person if it weren't for Ibn Taymiyya, stringing me along, trying to help me figure out stuff.
In what sense, different person?
I don't know. We don't know those questions, do we? We don't know who we'd be if we were somebody else. But it's given me it's been a very fascinating journey. And I enjoy trying to figure things out. And so he's given me a lot to figure out. I've been drawn into that. And thinking about theology from a different angle, particularly medieval theology, from a different perspective. As I said, he's much more modern with his more temporal understanding of God.
So what's your future interest in Ibn Taymiyya? Are you working on something right now?
Yes, yeah. So my main work is on Fakhruddin Razi and Ibn Taymiyya, and particularly on this question of how Ibn Taymiyya is responding to Fakhruddin Razi on the question of God's attributes, particularly regarding space and body and space, location. So Ibn Taymiyya was put in prison for these views, also for views on God's speech. I want to work on God's speech some more. He was in prison in 1306. He was let out 18 months later. Why was he let out? Why was he in prison in the first place? We have some ideas about that. There were political machinations behind the scenes. And then how did he articulate these views after he was let out of prison through the rest of his life? So I want to look at a more biographically at his intellectual development than has been possible before, because we now know a little bit more about the order of some of his major writings.
Interesting. So how people can know more about you and your work?
So I've published 2 books and lots of book chapters and articles. And the 2 books, there's first the 2007 book, which in English is called Ibn Taymiyya's Theodicy, A Perpetual Optimism. And so it's about his theodicy, it's about how he justifies God's creation of the world, and particularly evil in view of God's power and God's justice. And this is my PhD, much expanded and developed. And it's been translated into Arabic, so it's published 2007 in English and 2022 in Arabic. And the title is Nadariyat al-Ad al-Ilahi Aind Ibn Taymiyya. It's translated by Muhammad Khadr. Then my second book was published in English in 2019, and I attempted here to give Ibn Taymiyya's life and thought in the required maximum 55,000 words or less. So the series is called Makers of the Muslim World. It's published by One World Press here in London, and they have this series of books on key figures in the Islamic traditions. They need to be of a certain length. So I had to squeeze all of Ibn Taymiyya into that, 55,000
It's a great
words.
introduction to Ibn Taymiyya.
It's very kind of you to say
Yeah.
so. And it's been translated into Arabic as Ibn Taymiyya
عصره.
حياته وفكره.
Mhm.
It was published in 2020, translators Amru Basyuni. And Amru Basyuni has not abided by the 55,000 word limit,
Yeah.
and he's added a nice introduction and some footnotes and so forth. So there are other articles that have been translated into Arabic, and if you check my website, you can, I have a Google Sites website, and you can see the Arabic equivalents. Most of the Arabic articles are open access, which makes them easy to read. Yeah.
Professor Jon Hoover, pleased to have you today,
Yeah.
and thank you very much once again.
It's been my pleasure to be with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. An hour? Okay.
We talked for an hour.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, no
You
wonder you're
talked for an
tired.
hour.